So please join me in welcoming Jerry as he presents the Saga of a Ghost Town, Aral Lumber, Murder, and the House of David.
Well, here we are again, another Jerry's Story Hour. Uh, this is a story that a lot of you have heard snippets of through the years. There's always been stories about Aral. I heard them just because of the things that happened there. It was just another one in a long string of hastily put up lumber villages around the sawmill, but because of the things that happened there through the years, and because of the fact that we had some people write about it at the time, it's gained a little more fame than most of them and an interesting story. The way I put this title to the hook to get you in here, I don't want you to think that I'm inferring that the House of David committed the murders. They came along much afterwards.
Really good.
Before we go any further, I gotta give my sincere thanks to Andy Bolander, who is the most incredible researcher in the world. He got all the pictures together for me as he's done all the talks for all of us, and he's a walking encyclopedia of our collections. And so anyone's going to give a talk, you tell Andy and you get the stuff. So thank you, Andy. And also who used to give tours of the site when she worked for the Park Service as a summer ranger long ago. I'm trying to picture Jane in a ranger's uniform. And she did walking tours of that. So she had a lot to impart as well. The sources for this material mostly came from.
I need to get back to where you were.
Excuse me. Oh, I forgot you did that. Okay, where is the scene? You've all been there. This is the end of Esch Road. And so in the summer day when you got your family here and you're driving down the road to get to the Esch Road beach, did you ever imagine that what you're really driving through is this Main Street? Well, of course you didn't, because you're too busy trying to find a parking spot, because there aren't any. So suffice it to say that after you park a quarter mile up the road and hoof it to the beach with all your stuff, you're walking right down the main street of Aral. And when you get down there to the beach, that's where the dock was. And then you go right or left, depending on whether you're going to the family friendly beach or the clothing optional beach. I won't judge, and nor will I tell you which direction that I would go. So, the difference that you see from then to now is quite striking, but this was about the extent of the town at any time, and I'll show you later what those individual buildings, or this picture will come up again. Most of the material came out of this research book by Theodore and Bonita Reuschel that they did for the Historical Society in the 70s, and wrote a very thorough little booklet, which, by the way, we have copies of for sale back there. And we got lots of them, so on your way out, you can pick one up. The other source, which was really fascinating, was this. The memories of Herman Bain, an old guy that actually came from Germany to Traverse City and eventually out to Aral and then lived in Otter. And in 1938, as an old man, he wrote down longhand his memories of Traverse City and Aral and the people that were there that he worked with. It was a treasure chest, and sometime in the 80s, Chris Lindsay, that was a museum volunteer, transcribed the whole thing and made this little booklet. There's only one copy, but it's I'll use some of his quotes throughout the program. He wrote very colorfully. So where was it? Well, Lake Township goes from Crystal Lake all the way up to just south of Empire. The sawmill town of Aral was, I'm going backwards here. Right up here in the, I got big thumbs, excuse me. Get back here. Up, right up here in the corner, where this creek comes out, called Otter Creek, comes from Otter Lake. You've probably all seen it. And it dumps into Lake Michigan in a shallow bar right here. And you'll notice that the land around it was claimed is there's a lot of Bancrofts, Bancroft, 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 and the rest, and there's a whole lot of O'Learys. All this timberland inland, actually all the way to north of Honor. Down here, a little farther south along the coast was Edgewater that we talked about last year. And you'll see how the competition between the two, because they were in the same township, developed. The land became available in the Treaty of 1836, which you'll hear Robert Downs talk about next month, where we stole northern Michigan from the natives. And it had to be surveyed so the government could sell it. So they sent surveyors all through northern Michigan to do the surveys. And a guy named Orange Risden surveyed this whole area in 1850. And he liked that particular area that he found so much that between he and his wife, they bought 122 acres at the mouth of the creek in 1853 and 1859. But they lived in Saline, and there's no evidence they ever set foot on the property. But they owned it. And then in 1862, the Homestead Act came out. Anyone that would pay a registration fee and sit on land for 5 years and improve it could have 40 acres, I think it was. Maybe it was 160 acres, actually, you could get. And so that brought a lot of farmers up here to start cutting trees and pulling stumps. And then after the Civil War, a lot of veterans took advantage of that, and the people really flocked up north, but it was mostly for farming. They weren't thinking of lumbering. So enter Robert Bancroft and his family. His wife, Julia, his son, Bertie, who actually wasn't born at the time he moved there. There was a daughter, Anna, much older. She's not in the picture. And he was a Civil War photographer. And he moved to Traverse City after the war. And he had a studio up front in Union Streets. But then he began to accumulate properties in Lake and Platte townships. And he collected quite a few. And he bought and sold properties. He was kind of a real estate guy, and he made his living by flipping properties. And he finally, he bought Orange Risden's 122 acres for $600 and sold his assets in Traverse City in 1868, and he moved out to Otter Creek to farm. Although he wasn't much of a farmer, he built a log cabin and mostly got elected to township offices and bought and sold land. This was his cabin, comfortable little abode. And that is Robert and Julia with Anna in the middle. Don't know the dog's name. But that cabin lasted a long time. They lived in it for 20 years or better before they built a frame house. He cleared 20 acres of his allotment. He planted some fruit trees and locust trees, and you'll still see lots of locusts over in that part of the park. They were planted for fence posts, and if you had a lot of locust trees, you could sell them to the mills for fence posts. and they've kind of taken over there, and the park is now frantically trying to remove them all. But at one time they were sort of prized. And he did a little bit of livestock grazing and some crops for the family, but he wasn't really much of a big time farmer. So um, he when Lake Township was formed in 1873, he was one of the early supervisors, so he kind of made a living at that. Speaking of the development of Lake Township, I'll go back to the expanded version of that map. And if you've done any hiking around that area, you kind of know what this all was, but I find it fascinating. There was the road to Aral went across the bridge over Otter Creek and kept going and still does. And it kind of wanders this way down past Otter Lake and Bass Lake. And it hits the state highway, the Frankfort-Leland Highway down here right off Little Platte Lake. And a lot of those two tracks that go through the park there, probably some of those were part of this old road. So that's how you got to Aral from the south. There was a stagecoach periodically from Frankfort. And to the north, you didn't go out S Road to M22. That was too steep. You went up here to where Aral Road goes north and around the hill and then out to M22 and on to Empire. There was supposed to be a railroad, but it never came. They were hoping, and they thought it was going to come, but it never did. So that's the setting, and the only one living there was the Bancrofts. The Manistee-Leland Road was opened in 1870, and after that, it was a little easier getting around. So now we have Dr. Arthur O'Leary. He was a physician, sort of, and he was also a phrenologist and physiognomist. Phrenology was the study of heads and sizes thereof, and the larger the better, with the right kind of bumps on it and so on. Told a lot about your character and intelligence. It was proved to be a pseudoscience, but as one with a size 7.5 hat, I'm buying it. I think it's great science. And physiognomy was the study of facial, distance between the eyes and nose width. It's very racial, and it was a big thing at the time. So he gave lectures around the country, all over Canada, on that and health. And he would, before he'd come to town, he'd put handbills up and he'd rent office space. And after the lecture, he'd stick around for a couple of weeks in his office and he'd see people for consults, tell them, Herman Baines said that he could tell them what was wrong with them before he examined them just by their head, and accumulated a ton of money. And he was a visionary, so he thought timber was going to be the thing. So he bought large tracts of land, which you saw on that other map. Andy found me a drawing of it. There's no pictures of him that we know, but Andy found this drawing. Looks pretty scholarly. And this is one of his handbills. So he's going to have a lecture on physiology, phrenology, geology, talk about everything. Said he had the largest collection of skulls and specimens, rare and curious specimens, skulls of men and gorillas, skeletons. It was a heck of a lecture. So he made a lot of money. So he bought all this timberland, but he didn't know anything about running a sawmill or cutting logs. So he looked for someone that did. And someone tipped him off to a guy in Racine, Wisconsin named Charles T. Wright. He and his brother were running a lumber business there. They had a schooner on Lake Michigan, and he knew his way around a sawmill. Incidentally, I got to tell you, Herman Baines' description of O'Leary as also, you'll see this in common. Perry Hanna, first one he met. Hanna was a man about 5'6", about 150 pounds in weight. He had an uncommonly large head. He had great executive ability. He was a great judge of men and surrounded himself with the best talent in all responsible places. You see, he had a big head. Then he describes Dr. O'Leary. O'Leary stood about 5'8", had a strong chest and shoulders, had a large head, and as was the custom in those days, wore a full beard. And he was a phrenologist and so on. See, he knew his onions. He never asked his patients how they felt, but would tell them. So he's got all this land, and he finds Charles Wright, says, would you come and build a sawmill, a dock, get the timbering operation going, and you can lease the sawmill. You'll make all the profits from it. I'll buy the land from Bancroft. He was leasing it at the time, and we'll get an operation going. So Wright came and looked and said, yeah, I'll do that. And he had brought his boat over. They signed a lease agreement. Wright came over in 1878, and he got to work. And in 1879, he had a dock finished, built by some guys there. That was one of the best docks you'll ever see. It was 30 feet wide, 4 rows of pilings. Think of sinking all those in those days. And it was on Bancroft's land, and Bancroft's property taxes went from $40 to $400 in 1879. So that must have been when the dock was finished. But then in 1881, O'Leary bought that 30 acres from Bancroft, so he didn't have to worry about the taxes anymore. It was O'Leary's problem. Wright was really a great manager. You know, figure he had to build a 2-story sawmill, quarters for the men, horse barns, all the necessary outbuildings, blacksmith shop, arranged the timber cutting, which was mostly independent loggers that they bought the timber from. But all the thing about Otter Creek, and you'll hear me mostly call the town that's what everyone called it. No one called it Aral. That was just the post office name. But the thing about Otter Creek was all the timber was uphill inland. So it was all downhill, had a creek to dump the logs in and wash them, and Lake Michigan and a dock for ships right there. So ideal sawmill site. And so Wright managed to get all that arranged and done, and get the loggers signed up to sell their logs to him. He was in competition with the mill in Empire, the Wills mill, and they started undercutting his price. And Wright was a hot-tempered guy. He'd grown up in Arizona on his dad's ranch and rode mail between New Mexico and Arizona, dangerous thing, knew how to use a gun, and brandished it freely. And there were some stories of scrapes that he got in. It seemed like he was always in arguments with people or beating up people, but he was a great manager. And the loggers and the mill people really liked him. Herman Bain thought he was a hero and thought he got a raw deal later on. So he got things going, and he built this sawmill. Right, and you can see part of it. You can see the cement buttresses for the boiler and steam engine still down across Otter Creek to the south, and then off the road you head for the water, and you get down there through the poison ivy, and there's these cement buttresses down there. So it was quite close to the creek mouth. So they had a mill going, and here, get an idea of the town compared to what you see today. Here's the road, which is now Esch Road, right down to the beach. And all these buildings you saw in the picture lined up along Main Street. Everything on the north side was Bancroft. He kept all that property. build his frame house here. Eventually they built a store, you'll see. And then when they got enough kids, they needed a school, he donated the land up here at the base of the hill for the school. And here's the road that goes over the creek. And right here's the start of the Otter Creek hiking ski loop. Goes down around and eventually comes back down this road. So this road, they built a bridge over the creek, and it goes on to eventually, like I showed you, go to Frankfurt. The sawmill was here on the other side of the creek. And here, down here was the boarding quarters for the men. They called it Frenchtown because they had a lot of French Canadian loggers that didn't speak much English. So he got all this started and cut their first logs in 1882, got the ships to come take the lumber, and things were going pretty good. And he had 150 men about that worked in the mill yard and in the woods in the winter. 50 they kept on in the summer to run the mill, and the rest back to their farms. About 50 of the crew were Ottawa Indians, and they had a village just south of the French town where the loggers lived. And so when ships docked to be loaded with lumber, they didn't really have enough men there to spare to do that. So they'd blow the whistle, and the surrounding farms up on the highlands by M22, they'd hear that whistle and they'd say, oh, chance to make money. So they'd all run down there to load the ships. Wright was the first guy to think of icing the roads around here, and they were all downhill. And so he used ice roads to bring the logs down from up by M22 down the hill to the mill. So it was great for the kids because on Sundays when they weren't working, they'd take their sleds and go down those icy hills and attain great speeds and break a lot of bones in their little bodies. He registered the mill as C.T. Wright and Company, and then it eventually became the Otter Creek Lumber Company in 1886. And he registered a couple of log marks, which we have copies of in the book. These were the two log marks they used for that mill. Eventually, he commuted the first 7 years between Racine and Aral, and then moved his whole family there and built this store, which he lived up above the family. So it was the Wright store. And through the years, it changed to different things. It became the Hathaway store, eventually became a community hall. And Herman Bain lived in back here for a while when he worked there. Other than that, we have Pete Rubier, a commercial fisherman's house, and what they called the company store of the succeeding logging companies. And eventually this became the boarding house for the women of the Israelites when they moved here, because the men and women couldn't live together, which is a bad recipe for growing your population, but so be it. And on the other side of the street is all Bancroft. You got the store, the house here, and the store over here, I believe it is. That might be the store, and the house is behind it, I guess. Yeah. And you can still, if you go off in the woods by where you park here, you can stumble upon some cement foundations there. Because the Bancrofts were the first ones here and the last ones out, as you'll see. Where are we? After a while, they had enough kids they needed a school, so they built this fine school. And you'll see a good percentage of the population of the town there. In 1883, they got a post office, and that's when the town officially became Aral because Otter Creek was already taken. And Aral came from, some say it was a name in Ireland that O'Leary came up with. Some say it was after the Russian Sea. I don't know which is right. So in 1876, the Bancrofts had a son, Bertie. And so as he grew up in his childhood and there was other kids in town, they needed the school, and Bancroft donated the land for that. This is later in like 1900. You see by then the school had been changed to a frame building as the whole school. And by 1910, another school picture. And I noticed there were all these black kids. And I asked Andy to see what on the picture it said they were hall, so-and-so hall, so-and-so hall. So Andy looked up and he said, yeah, there's a Samuel Hall that was a farmer in the census of those years, early 1900s, that had a farm up by M22 somewhere up there, and he had a whole bunch of kids. And I didn't even know that there was a black family in Lake Township. Remember the little kid down on the bottom, remember him? That's Beaver Edwards, the Beeve. And he's going to come up later, so remember him. This is finally Robert Bancroft built himself a new house, got out of the log cabin. The log cabin was in back of it, and they moved the post office there into the house in 1883. This time I do know the dog, that's Jack. So things are going along good. Mill's producing, crews are working, guys are getting paid. Things were great until that fateful day in our melodrama in 1889. Introducing the characters. This is Neil Marshall. The Marshalls were a very well-known family in Benzonia amongst the founders. We have, and it'd be cool if you could read it sometime, there's an account of the journey of Anne Sinclair Marshall from Ontario to Benzonia with an ox cart, and Neil, her teenage son, and little Maggie riding on the flour barrel or something. And to think the arduous journey that she took, it's incredible. Someone had told them about this new town, Benzonia, with lots of good land available, and they came. And so the Marshall clan were very well known and popular. And not only that, Neil here had married a Waters, also another pioneer family. They had 4 daughters, and so between them, they were staunch pillars of the community. And he served as a sometimes deputy to the sheriff, A.B. Case, at that time. And he was deputized for this particular job that he had to do. The other guy involved was Frank Thurber, who was the treasurer of Lake Township, lived in a house that actually belonged to O'Leary just up Esch Road, up the hill a ways, and was a physician. I'm not sure if he practiced here or not, but he came from downstate somewhere and had been a physician. So the story is that Wright was really feeling put upon because this is an interesting situation. You had a great competition between Edgewater and Aral, Otter Creek, township offices every time an election would come up. And whoever won would raise the taxes on the other town's lumber and limit their own. So people would vote for their guy because, he's going to stick it to those guys and lower my taxes. Some things never change. And so this particular election, the Edgewater guy came to everyone around Aral and said, I'm going to lower everyone's taxes and I'm going to stick it to Charles Wright in his lumber mill. So he got elected. And so Wright was feeling put upon, and he'd paid his taxes under protest the year before, said that he had been taxed on his barge in Wisconsin, but they couldn't find any evidence of that. He didn't get credit for the stretch of road he built through town, and so on, big argument. So Sheriff Case, the township decided to put a lien on his logs, and it would mean shutting down his mill, and all the people that were working there would be thrown out of work. So on that hot August day, Deputy Marshal came up from Honor and met Frank Thurber, and the two of them encountered Mr. Wright, who was carrying his Marlin rifle, and of course, sheriff's deputy would be armed. And arguments ensued for most of the day. They said, you got to stop the logs, and he said, don't stop the logs, my men got to keep working, and anyone that tries to stop them, I'll drop them. And so everyone went away for a while, temperatures cooled, and Marshall and Ferber came back to try and argue with him some more. Argument ensued, and interestingly, the account that I have to share with you from the florid prose of the day, Wright met Marshall, and words passed between the two, which could not have been very satisfactory to the desperado, for the fiend suddenly jumped in front of the tall deputy, leveled his rifle at his breast, and fired. The leaden messenger accomplished its murderous purpose, and the lifeless body of Neil Marshall, honest, upright citizen, and brave officer, lay stretched in the dust at the feet of the assailant. And then Thurber tried to jump him, and he pulled a revolver out of his pocket and shot him in the head. So you got two dead guys in the middle of the bridge, right by the bridge. Some townspeople came out and put umbrellas over them, and Wright went, and the mills kept working. Everyone kept working. There'd been a few witnesses. The mill just kept working. Finally, at the end of the shift, he had all his men come in, he paid them off, went and had supper, and then took his rifle and headed for the woods going north. Well, word had gotten around to the locals around there, and they were mad, formed a mob, and were ready to hang him on the spot when they found him. And there was a telegraph wire, and the telegraph was sent to Sheriff Case that there was trouble and the deputy had been murdered. And so he went from Honor to Frankfort, gathered a 20-man posse, the prosecuting attorney, and a reporter, commandeered the Douar, the ship, and the 20 men headed up the coast from Frankfort, and they got there about sundown. Here's the bridge some years later, the site of all the mayhem. This is the newspaper article in the Benzie Banner by the reporter who accompanied the posse. And then he got everyone's story when he got there. And they took the Douar, the ship, and they tracked down Wright. Well, they didn't track him down. He was disappeared. So the mob is standing around. The sheriff's posse tries to cool him down. They start searching. And one of the Indians that worked there, they thought he knew where he had gone. And so they got a rope and put it over the Indian's neck, strung him up on the hanging tree, the pine tree that stood there for many years, until the 60s, I think it was there, and was known as the hanging tree. I never saw it, but some of you may have. And the first time they took him up, let him down, no talk, didn't know English. Second time, no talk. Third time, he said, okay, I'll talk. But right about that time, two guys came out of the woods to the north with Charles Wright, and he said, Sheriff, protect me, because he thought he was going to get strung up right there. And Sheriff said, I will protect you. and the poor Indian was saved, but according to Herman Bain, he had a crooked neck the rest of his life. So back they went to Frankfurt on the boat, the whole bunch. He was held for trial, and he was convicted, of course, but it took 240 men to find a jury of 12 that weren't biased or supposedly weren't biased. But, you know, it was a fairly speedy trial. And the trial was held in Cases Hall. They didn't have a courthouse at the time, right over there. The sheriff A.B. Case brought him, and the presiding judge, W.L. Case, held the trial in Cases Hall. But they did get a jury finally. They had a preliminary examination, saw that there was enough duty. They were worried about a hanging. The sheriff had to send him to Traverse City before the circuit court was due in 7 months and lodge him there at Benzie County expense, and the newspapers didn't like that very much, but they brought him back for the trial. And everyone told their story, and he was sent to Jackson for life, hard labor. And on the way there, the sheriff took him down to Jackson, where he became a favorite of the warden. And it was quite a thing. On the way down, the train stopped in Cadillac for dinner, and the paper said they stopped there for their noon meal, and the stopover was recorded by the Cadillac paper. The hotel dining room had a congenial but conglomerate group at its festive board, consisting of Sheriff Case and his prisoner, the millionaire murderer Wright, a former female candidate for president, a revered minister, and several plebeian innkeepers. So after that, things got back to normal. You had all the residents there. You see the 200 or so population in front of the company store. People went back to work. His widow, or Wright's widow and her brother finished that season's cutting at the sawmill, and then got various others to run it. The population here on a day at the beach, from the looks of it, they are not going to the clothing optional part of the beach. Somewhere in there is Julia Bancroft is this lady, I think, and Robert is one of these guys, might be that one. And little Birdie is somewhere here. But the town was doing okay, but the lumber was starting to run out. And about that time, O'Leary, who owned the land around it, got his niece's husband in Detroit to come, named Montgomery, to run the mill. And he ran it for a few years until the day in 1890, what was it? 1899, the mill burned down, as all of them did eventually. Montgomery went back to Detroit, and shortly after that, O'Leary was in a streetcar accident, and he died, and so all that property was in a trust. So then people started moving out, because there were the Hathaway brothers from Lake Ann tried the mill for a while. The Mann brothers did the cedar shingles for a while. People started moving out, and property became available. A lot of the houses became vacant. Oh, I'm going backwards. No, I'm not. Let me see where I'm going here. Yeah, people started moving out, leaving these buildings vacant. So along comes good old Benjamin Purcell and his wife Mary, founders of the House of David. And they had a colony on High Island up by Beaver to cut timber for profit and raise crops for the main colony in Benton Harbor. So by 1908, they were looking at Otter Creek because there was still a little timber. They thought they could do something with it. They had a dock that they could repair, and they had farmland. So they brought a colony here, and about the only ones left were the Bancroft and Bertie, who went to school with these Israelite kids. And they were all very friendly and all got along fine. But the House of David, after 3 years, weren't making a profit. They had this fine big ship, the Rising Sun, that they used. And here's the community when they were living here. Men lived in the men's house, the women's lived in the women's house, and they got together for dinner. They had the Rising Sun, this very substantial ship that the House of David organization owned. There you see it there. Here you see it later, as happened to many ships. And you can see it today. If you go out to the end of Pyramid Point on a quiet day when the water is low, you look down and you can see the outline of it where it sank in 1917 on a run from their colony at High Island down to Benton Harbor. So what happened to the Bancrofts? Well, after the House of David got on their boat and moved out, incidentally, they had a great baseball team, as you might imagine, and they beat all the teams around up and down the coast. They had a band in red uniforms, and they'd all get on the boat and they'd go up and down the coast, and typical activities of the House of David. But they left, and it was just basically the Bancrofts, a few other people, but not many. So Bertie was an adult by now and had siblings, and he married a girl named Donna Ramo in 1898, whose father had once worked as a blacksmith there for Charlie Wright. She was 16, he was 21, and they carried on farming a little. Bertie worked in the Empire Mill and raised some crops. And by 1922, they were the only ones left. Only one light burned in Aral. So they carried on for 10 years until 1922. Here's the Bancroft house. Robert had died in 1906 and Julia 1910. And so then they moved into their house. They'd been living above the store and raised the rest of their family. And in 1922, they gave up. Here's the dock in 1915. That's what the lake will do if you abandon something for long. In 1922, he sold off some of his land. They loaded up their Model T, went up the hill and looked back, and it was the last look of anyone at Aral, almost, because in 1935, our friend Beaver Edwards came back, acquired the property at the creek mouth, and built himself a cottage, because by that time he was a fairly famous sculptor in Detroit. And this was from the Detroit newspaper I got from Jane. The hanging tree was still there then. You see it behind his cottage. And this was him where he did a lot of church work from the state of clothing. I don't think this was one of his church pieces. And so they moved to Muskegon, Bertie and Donna. The kids were all grown. He worked at a gas station. 3 years later, 1925, he comes back. The Bancrofts are back, but not to Aral. He still owned a bunch of property there. They came back and bought 40 acres on Long Lake, our Long Lake right down here, and built this. Whoops, excuse me. They built, yeah, here's their sign. They built Kentucky Inn, had famous chicken dinners and rooms, and you could come here in your Model T and stay and explore the area. But it lasted so long that some of the people I've talked to remember going there for the chicken dinners as kids. because Bernie and Donna ran that until they died in the mid-60s. And there it is at that time. You can still see it today when you go along M22, right there. The park has restored the roof, and I don't know what they're going to do with it. And I think that's the end of our tale of Aral. So anyone have questions, we'll entertain them. You want to turn up the lights, man?
Yeah, and if you guys would please wait to receive the microphone for
Because-
asking your
so the-
question.
So the Zoom people can hear. So Don has a question.
I hadn't heard about this Beaver Edwards house. Is there any trace of that left?
I don't think so. It was down on the sand dune right by the creek, and I think it's been swept away. And it wasn't very substantial. It was a cottage. They just came up for a few weeks in the summer. I've not heard there was any trace of it. Bill?
How long that dock was?
Wait a minute, wait for the microphone. Go ahead, Al.
Do you have any idea how long the dock was?
Well, it was, I should, I know it was 40 feet wide and long enough for a lumber schooner to pull up to, but I can't really tell you how long it was.
Because I remember when I first started coming up here.
There were
Yeah,
pilings
you could see
visible
the pilings
until
out there,
like
yeah.
the 70s.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
oh yeah.
yeah.
There were some pilings visible.
Can you say a little bit about this House of David group and what they were all about? I don't know anything.
Oh, you
about
haven't
that.
heard the House of David lecture?
No.
Oh, we had that a few years ago, but it was a religious sect headquartered in Benton Harbor. They had some odd beliefs. The men all wore long beards, and they lived separately from the women. You had turned all your property over to the commune and held it in common. They tried to get Robert Bancroft to turn his over to the common good, but he refused. They had, besides the religious activities, they were pretty good businessmen. Down in Benton Harbor, they built an incredible amusement park with rides and stuff that may still be there. I mean, they had a zoo. They had people went there for vacations from all over the Midwest. They had a baseball team that could beat anyone, and a band. And then they did these outpost colonies up a high island and the one here to feed lumber down there to sell and build things and crops to feed the people. So yeah, that's about all I know. It was a religious sect, which officially I think is still there. I think there still might be a headquarters office in Benton Harbor.
As far as Beaver Edwards House goes, Jerry, there is a stone foundation that is still there. My husband and I found it a number of years ago. So there is.
Out by the creek mouth
Yeah.
on the top of the first little rise?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
well, there is a trace then.
Yeah. And I also read too that Beaver Edwards made prosthetic devices for people who came back from World War II.
Oh,
That was one of the
Yeah.
little pieces that I learned through the years. And lastly, you're a treasure.
well, I'm going to go out there this spring and look for that. Maybe there might be some. I've seen the Bancroft foundations, but not that. What is it? Oh,
Jerry,
yeah.
tell everybody what happened to Wright.
Oh, I forgot. Yeah.
His hard labor.
I'm sorry. I
and
had to go fast because, right, interestingly enough, this was great. In 1899, he was pardoned by the governor, Hazen Pingree, on his last act before he left office. And no one quite knew why, but Hazen Pingree and the parole board had done some investigation and felt that he hadn't gotten a fair trial. Maybe. I mean, how's he going to get a fair trial in Benzie County, for God's sakes? So he'd made friends in the prison administration and had been a model guy. And so Hazen Pingree, as he's leaving office, doesn't parole him, he pardons him. He's out the door and gone after 10 years, serving 10 years. So what he did was made a quick trip to Aral because he talked to Bertie Bancroft and Pete Stormer, and then went on to Wisconsin. And out there somewhere, he found his wife, who had remarried a carpenter, thought he was gone for life, and she asked him to sing her favorite song. Apparently, he had a great singing voice, because after he sang to her, she was weeping. Her carpenter husband was so moved or threatened, I'm not sure which, that the wife left him and went off with Charlie Wright and never to be seen again. And here's the reaction in Benzie County from the pardon. He has promptly paroled him in spite of vehement protest by friends and relations of both Marshall and Thurber. Pingree's name and fame were badly sullied in Benzie County long before his gargantuan statue was sullied by the overfed pigeons in one of Detroit's downtown parks. Who else? Thank you, Jane. I completely forgot that part.
Jerry,
Yeah.
is the Case family you talked
Mhm.
about it in the past, the same Case family that's here in Benzie County?
Heck yeah, we got them right here. In fact, AB Case, Bertie, was Charlotte's grandfather, great-grandfather, great uncle. That's right. It was the other branch of the family. Yeah, WL Case, that was early in his judicial career, I guess. He may have been magistrate, but he was presiding at the hearing. I know that.
Did you say that the sheriff only had daughters? Because if that's the case, I was
No,
wondering how these
I
two
said,
got here.
who the had daughters? Marshall, yeah, Neil Marshall had 4 daughters.
Different Marshall than these guys?
Yeah, well, there's been a Neil Marshall in the family ever since, but he must have had, maybe there wasn't just daughters.
I'm John Marshall, and
Yeah,
I think Mr. Wright got a fair trial.
Yeah. Yeah.
My brother Neil Marshall,
Ah,
named
okay.
after Neil A. Marshall, who was murdered.
So there was a son.
So Neil A. Marshall was our great great uncle.
Yeah.
Our great grandfather was his brother, who was William
Oh.
Marshall.
Okay, that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, the story that you've told was spectacular. Jerry did a great job. Our
Well,
family has researched
Hearing
this.
it from the Marshalls, I'm
Yeah.
glad. And I don't want you to get overstimulated by the whole thing.
You
We
did
don't have
great.
any Thurbers here, I don't think.
No, there are none. Your story about tracing the trail from the creek down towards Honor.
Yeah.
So in our little family tradition, our history had been, and it may not be accurate, your research may dispute this, but when word from the telegram of the murders took place, it got to Honor. Marshall Road is not too far from Honor,
Yeah.
and our family was there. And there was a posse that was corralled, went up the road, got there before the boat from Franklin with
Mhm.
the sheriff on there. And not proud of this, but we were informed as kids that it was our great grandfather, who then arranged for the hanging of Lahala.
That was Bill Marshall?
That was Bill.
Yeah, he was mentioned in the book. He was a big angry guy carrying a
big.
gun. And in fact, when they found Marshall in the woods and brought him back and the sheriff was trying to protect him, it mentioned that William Marshall was ready to shoot him right there, and the sheriff had to wrestle the gun out of his hands.
Yeah, we're not proud of that, but
I can imagine feelings were running high.
yeah, I think so. And Neil A. Marshall was 6'7". He was the largest man in Benzie County.
Yeah, he was a huge guy,
Big
huge
guy.
guy.
And
Yeah.
Great.
It doesn't say anything about the size of his head, so
I did not inherit that part.
thank you. I'm glad you pointed that out, John.
So about a mile south of Aral, there's a road marked Aral Lodge Road.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you know anything about that.
Well, yeah, that was back before the park came along. there was a deer camp back there, a cement building that was owned by a group of guys from downstate somewhere. And they just, because it was near Aral, they called it Aral Lodge. But this was like mid 1900s, long after Aral. That was just the name they picked for their deer camp and the road to it, which was a kind of a private road at that time.
Interesting.
Then
Thank
the
you.
county, when they took it over, because the county wants to get all the miles of roads in their inventory that they can to get gas tax on it, they just gave it that name. But that has nothing to do with Aral.
Interesting. That makes sense. Thank you.
Alrighty, any other questions? Any questions on Zoom?
Anyone want to do a mock trial? I wish I could have heard what song he sang to his wife. Because man, I could have used that in my dating days. All right, next month is, well, Matt will tell you, but it's kind of related to this story. Oh, we got Zoom questions?
Just a comment that 2 of the Hall children were killed and died in a fire.
That's right. I remember reading that when I was doing the researches. Andy, what? They had 6 kids? Yeah. That was like in the early 1900s. I remember the paper article about it, the 1920-ish, late teens. Yeah, it was a big headline in the Benzie paper.
All right.
Anything else? All right,
Can
tell
we
them about
give-
next month.
Yep. Can we give Jerry another round of applause, please?